Hi, my name is Chrisy Clay. I'm Floodplain Officer for Rous County Council and I stand here today on Bundjalung country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land who were the original floodplain landowners. So my role at Council is to reduce the natural resource management impact of our flood mitigation assets. Rous County Council is the flood mitigation authority for the Richmond River floodplain, and we have a vast network of assets that we're responsible for. The assets fall into a few different categories. So we have levees, we have drainage systems and canals, and then we also have floodgate structures as well. So our flood mitigation assets that we have are there to mitigate the impacts of floods. Our flood mitigation assets are largely historical and were put in place. There was a lot of flood mitigation assets put in place in the 1950s and 60s following the 1954 flood. The 1954 flood was the biggest flood that we have on record here in the Richmond River. But a lot of our flood mitigation assets were actually in place well before that. So the late 1800s, the early 1900s, we had a lot of assets already in place. They're there to reduce the impacts of floods, so to reduce inundation and to move floodwaters away from different places. This flood mitigation on the Richmond floodplain has been essential for the establishment and expansion of agriculture, but also the settlement, the rural settlement of the floodplain and the establishment of the villages. Unfortunately, what we didn't know at the time is that there would be unintended environmental consequences from those works. So the flood mitigation assets that we have in place have intrinsically altered the very fundamental characteristic of our floodplain. There's not an aspect of the floodplain that hasn't been unchanged by the flood mitigation works. The hydrology has been completely altered, and that has then completely altered the vegetation types, the biodiversity and the ecosystems that we have there. They've also impacted on water quality, both on the drainage systems and in the estuary themselves. So the two main water quality issues that we have related to flood mitigation, and particularly to floodplain drainage, are acidity from acid sulfate soils and then deoxygenated water, black water from rotting vegetation. Both of those are associated with the floodplain drainage systems and the alteration that's made to the floodplain. Acid sulfate soils are a naturally occurring floodplain sediment that are distributed across our floodplain. The sediment is high in iron sulfides, and when they are exposed to air, they oxidise, they produce acid, and can also release toxic element from the surrounding soils, most commonly in the form of iron and aluminium. Our drainage systems intercept this soil, exposes it to air, which allows that acid and iron and aluminium to be produced and mobilised, and then that acidity can wash into the drains either from surface water or from groundwater drainage, which makes its way down into the estuaries and into the waterways. So the impact from acid sulfate soils and the acidity that comes downstream is really felt by the downstream aquatic ecosystems. So these ecosystems are regularly subject to high levels of acidity and high levels of iron and aluminium, which can be toxic. Worst case scenario, we can have fish kills from that, but there are much more subtler impacts that are much harder to see in terms of changing to breeding patterns, changing to habitats. So it just makes it a lot harder for aquatic animals and aquatic plant life to have the diversity and to grow in these locations. Black water, or deoxygenated water, is caused by the change that's occurred from floodplain drainage on the lowest lying parts of the floodplain. Floodplain drainage has taken the hydrology and the flooding patterns of these areas and completely changed it. Before floodplain drainage, these low-lying areas would have retained water for up to 6 to 9 months of the year, and some would have been permanently wet. Floodplain drainage, although our assets are historical, they're still very efficient in removing surface water. So nowadays, in many cases, we can remove surface water from the lowest lying parts of the floodplain in as little as 30 days. What that's done is it's changed the vegetation type that occur in these low-lying areas. These low-lying areas would have been former back swamps and floodplain wetlands. They would have contained reeds and rushes and wetland plants that would have been okay with inundation. But now we've changed them by draining them, and now the main vegetation type is dryland pasture. The dryland pasture, as soon as it's inundated, starts to decompose and rots. When we experience the most severe impacts from blackwater events is during the summer months. If we have a major flood event during summer and the floodplain fills up, these low-lying areas become very inundated. All of the dryland pasture becomes flooded, and with the warmer temperatures it basically cooks. That creates a lot of organics, a lot of breakdown matter, and when that's discharged into the estuary, it can actually start to deplete dissolved oxygen out of the actual waterways. We've seen some quite severe impacts from that here on the Richmond River. The most severe was in 2001. In 2001, I worked on the floodplain and I saw firsthand the impacts from that fish kill. So the entire estuary had no dissolved oxygen left in it. We had dissolved oxygen levels of 0 milligrams per litre, and nothing can live in that. So we had all levels of the food web, all levels of the food chain die en masse. Fish, crustaceans, oysters, seagrass, benthic worms even, prawns, mud crabs, creatures that could get up out of the water and walk away, they all died. 2008 was followed up with another fish kill event. So we've had very severe impacts from deoxygenated water events in the Richmond River estuary. This reoccurs regularly, not as severe as 2001 and 2008, but every summer months when we have a flood, there's a risk of deoxygenation occurring again. What we see on the Richmond floodplain is an unfortunate cycle of water quality issues. In the summer months when we receive most of our rainfall, we have increased sedimentation coming down the catchment in turbidity with the floodwater. That's followed up in summer months by possible deoxygenated water coming out of our low-lying back swamps. Once that surface water drains off, we can then get high acidity levels coming off from the acid sulphate soils, particularly groundwater that's been acidified, and you'll have waterways that will go whole different types of colours. It can go rusty orange from iron, but you can also get this aqua green colour, which is an indication of high levels of aluminium being discharged into the waterways. So in terms of recovery times for the estuary, it's unknown. We know that we go through an unfortunate cycle of sedimentation, black water and then acidity. Quite often we see that the best water quality we have in the estuary now is simply when we don't have rain, when we have dry periods, until we get the next flood event and we start the cycle again. And this is part of why the Richmond River has been classified as one of the most degraded and worst in New South Wales. So this continual cycle of poor water quality has many impacts downstream. So we see that most acutely in the aquatic ecosystems, the aquatic habitats and animals that live downstream. We also see that in the end users, in the recreational fishermen, the commercial fishermen. After the 2001 fish kill, our Richmond River estuary was shut to all forms of fishing for 6 months to allow the river to recover. We also see an impact on tourism and businesses downstream in Ballina. In 2001, when the river was shut, there was an obvious impact in tourism, bait and tackle stores, there was no fishing. Even nowadays, even with just normal summer floods that we have, the river's undesirable to swim in. We had that in Christmas last year and then Easter again this year. So there's a lot of issues that we face here on the Richmond River, and the role that I have is particularly challenging and it's complex, and there's not a lot of easy answers, but there are things we can do. We're quite lucky in this space that the science has been done. We have really clear answers on what needs to be done and really clear understanding of the dynamics at play. With acid sulphate soils, there's a number of different things that we can do. Council has an active floodgate management program. At the moment we have 52 floodgated systems that are actively managed, where we allow river water to exchange back with the drainage system. The active floodgate management program delivers better water quality by diluting or neutralising any acidity that's in the drainage systems before it enters into the estuary. This program's been going on now for around 20 years, so it's a well-established program that delivers good results for water quality. So there's been a lot of work done in the past 20 to 25 years in this space in terms of engaging with landowners, raising their awareness, building their capacity to understand the issues, but also what can be done with it. We've had really good gains of working with agricultural industries. The New South Wales sugarcane industry took the lead on acid sulphate soil management with development of farm management plans, and that actually led to a drastic reduction in drainage density on cane farms. A lot of old drains were filled in through laser levelling, and that made a big benefit for in terms of acidity and acid sulphate soils. Tackling the issue of blackwater is a lot more complicated. By its very nature, blackwater is created from the fundamental changes that we've made to the lowest lying floodplain wetlands. The science says that how we rectify that is by reducing the drainage of these areas. Unfortunately, at this stage, the only mechanism that we have to do change is through the goodwill of landowners. The science is telling us that the management changes that need to occur are ones that are likely to have a negative impact on their land, on their ability to do agricultural activities, on the agricultural productivity, and also potentially on the resale value of their land. So it's very difficult to garner support from landowners to make the quite significant changes that we need to have occur from goodwill alone. Rous County Council continues to cooperate with all different stakeholders involved with this very complex and historical issue. We work with agricultural industries, landowners, other local councils and state government to raise awareness of these issues and the measures that will need to be taken to rectify and improve water quality in the Richmond River. Ultimately, improving the health of the Richmond River estuary and the water quality leaving the floodplain will be a question for the community about how much they value the health of the estuary and how we want floodplain areas to be run and used going forward.